It was the middle of the 13th century, a time of soaring cathedrals and dense, complicated arguments. In Paris, or maybe Naples, a quiet, heavy-set Dominican friar named Thomas Aquinas sat with parchment and ink. He was building his great work, the Summa Theologiae, a book that tried to explain everything about God and humanity. Here, he wasn't thinking about a modern hospital. He wasn't thinking about ventilators or morphine drips. He was thinking about morality. He was thinking about a man defending himself from an attacker. The man's act of self-defense has two effects. One effect is saving his own life, which is good. The other effect is the death of his attacker, which is bad. Is the act then good or bad? Aquinas reasoned his way through it. The morality, he argued, depends on the intention. If the man's primary intention is to save his own life, the act is permissible. The death of the attacker is a foreseen but unintended consequence. He called this the principle of double effect. The action itself must be good or neutral. The good effect must be the one you intend. The bad effect must not be the means to the good effect. And there must be a serious reason for allowing the bad effect to happen. Hundreds of years later, this idea, born from a scholastic debate about self-defense, walks the halls of every modern hospital. A doctor stands at the bedside of a patient with terminal cancer. The patient is in terrible consuming pain. The doctor can administer a high dose of morphine to relieve the suffering. That is the intention, the good effect. But the doctor also knows that such a high dose of morphine will suppress the patient's respiratory system and likely hasten their death. That is the foreseen but unintended bad effect. Is it permissible? The ethical framework that allows the doctor to say yes, to prioritize the relief of suffering even at the risk of shortening life, is a direct inheritance from that 13th century friar. The questions we struggle with in our clean, technologically advanced medical world are often the same questions they wrestled with by candlelight, using logic and faith as their tools. The language has changed, but the fundamental human dilemmas have not. Number 10, the price of a cure is not always measured in money. In the spring of 1961, a small anonymous committee met in a room in Seattle, Washington. They weren't doctors or politicians. They were a lawyer, a minister, a banker, a housewife, a state official, a labor leader, and a surgeon. They held in their hands the power of life and death. A doctor at the Swedish hospital, Belding Scribner, had developed a breakthrough device, the Scribner shunt. It was a small U-shaped tube that could be permanently implanted in a patient's arm, allowing them to be connected to an artificial kidney machine for dialysis again and again. Before this, dialysis was a one-time, temporary measure. Scribner had invented chronic dialysis. He had invented a way to keep people with kidney failure alive. But there was a problem. The hospital only had enough machines and staff to treat a handful of patients. Many more people in Seattle needed the treatment than could receive it. The demand vastly outstripped the supply. So the hospital created the Admissions and Policy Committee of the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center. The press later called them the God Committee. Their job was to choose who would live and who would be sent home to die. They weren't given medical criteria. The doctors had already screened the patients to ensure they were medically suitable. This committee had to decide on other grounds. They debated the social worth of the candidates. They asked questions. Does this person have a job? Do they have children? Are they a valuable member of the community? An article in Life magazine in 1962 detailed their process. They chose an aircraft mechanic with 6 children over a chemical engineer with a smaller family. They chose a young mother. They rejected a well-off accountant because he couldn't demonstrate a strong connection to his community. The committee's existence caused a national outcry. People were horrified by the idea of a secret group deciding who was worthy of life based on social factors. It felt cold, utilitarian, and unjust. The debate it sparked has never gone away. It echoes every time a hospital has too few ICU beds during a pandemic. And it is present in every discussion about organ transplant lists. Who gets the lung, the heart, the kidney? Well, should it be the person who has been waiting the longest, the person with the best chance of a long life after the transplant, the person with the most dependents? We have tried to create objective systems using points and medical data to avoid the raw, subjective judgment of the God Committee. But the core problem remains. When a life-saving resource is scarce, how do we decide who gets it? The question of allocation is a brutal one. This is not a new problem. It is a very old one, made stark and terrible by plagues. In 1347, the Black Death arrived in Europe. It was a catastrophe on a scale we can barely comprehend, killing perhaps half the population in just a few years. It presented physicians with a triage problem of unimaginable proportions. There were too many sick and too few people to care for them. Their doctors, who were often trained in the theories of Galen and Hippocrates, had few effective treatments. Their role was as much about providing comfort and prognosis as it was about cure, but they still had to choose where to spend their time. Consider the world of Guy de Chauliac. He was one of the most famous surgeons of the 14th century, a physician to popes in Avignon, France. When the plague struck Avignon in 1348, he stayed. He did not flee, as many other doctors did. He documented the two forms of the disease he saw, the pneumonic and the bubonic. He treated patients, and he even contracted the plague himself and survived. In his book, The Chirurgia Magna, he wrote about the helplessness of physicians. The plague was so contagious, he wrote, that it was transmitted not only by living with the sick, but even by looking at them. In this chaos, a doctor like Chauliac had to make choices. Who did he visit? The wealthy bishop who could pay him, and whose health might be important for the stability of the city. Or the poor craftsman in a crowded tenement, whose entire family was sick. The medieval framework for this decision was not based on modern ideas of public health or utilitarianism. It was based on the Christian concept of caritas, or charity. Medieval hospitals like the famous Hotel Dieu in Paris were not primarily places of medical cure in the modern sense. They were religious institutions, hospices founded to care for the poor and the sick as a spiritual duty. They offered shelter, food, and prayer. The care was an act of Christian love, but this concept of charity had its own form of triage. The system was built on the idea of the deserving poor. To be admitted to a place like the Hotel Dieu, a person had to be not just poor and sick, but also seen as morally worthy of help. A hospital's resources were a gift from God, distributed by the church. They had to be used wisely. A person who was seen as a sinner, unrepentant, or a troublemaker might be turned away. The decision was not made by a committee of lay people in a boardroom, but by monks or nuns at the hospital gate. Their criteria were not about social contribution in the way the Seattle Committee saw it, but about spiritual state. Were you a good Christian? Did you confess your sins? The goal was not just to save the body, but to save the soul. This created a moral calculus that looks different from ours, but the function was the same. It was a system for allocating scarce resources based on a perceived value of the individual. The Seattle Committee valued family, employment, and community involvement. The medieval hospital valued piety, repentance, and faith. In both cases, people outside the medical profession made judgments about a person's character to decide if they were worthy of care. The medieval doctor, facing a street full of plague victims, had to weigh his duty to God, his duty to his paying clients, and his own personal safety. He might choose to treat a nobleman not just for the money, but because the social order was seen as divinely ordained. Maintaining that order was a moral good. Letting a poor man die, while tragic, did not threaten the foundations of society in the same way. The language of social worth used in Seattle in 1962 was a secular echo of the spiritual worth that a medieval institution would have considered. The fundamental uncomfortable question has always been there: when we cannot save everyone, how do we choose? Number 9, a doctor's silence can be a patient's burden. On October 27, 1969, a young man named Prosenjit Podar killed a young woman named Tatiana Tarasoff in Berkeley, California. It was a tragedy born of unrequited love and obsession. But what turned it into a landmark case for medical ethics happened 2 months earlier. Podar was a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley, and he had become obsessed with Tarasoff after they met at a folk dancing class. When she rejected him, his mental state deteriorated. He sought therapy at the university's Cowell Memorial Hospital. During a session with his psychologist, Dr. Lawrence Moore, Podar confessed his intention to kill Tatiana Tarasoff, and Dr. Moore was alarmed. He believed the threat was credible. He consulted with his supervisors, and they made a decision. They notified the campus police. The police briefly detained Podar, questioned him, and then released him when he promised to stay away from Tarasoff. Crucially, no one warned Tatiana Tarasoff or her family directly. Dr. Moore's superior, the director of the psychiatry department, ordered that all records of the therapy sessions be destroyed and that no further action be taken. 2 months later, Podar went to Tarasoff's home and killed her. Her parents sued the university, the therapists, and the campus police. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court of California. In 1976, the court issued a momentous ruling. It found that a mental health professional has a duty not just to their patient, but also to the potential victims of that patient. The protective privilege ends where the public peril begins, the court wrote. This created what is now known as the Tarasoff duty, or the duty to protect. It meant that a therapist's promise of confidentiality was not absolute. If a patient posed a serious threat of harm to a specific person, the therapist had a legal and ethical obligation to take steps to protect that person, which could include warning them directly. The Tarasoff case set off a huge debate that continues today. On one side is the principle of patient confidentiality. For therapy to work, a patient must feel safe to reveal their darkest thoughts and fears without judgment or fear of disclosure. If they know their words can be reported, they may not be honest, and the chance for treatment could be lost. On the other side is the safety of the public. Does a doctor's private duty to a patient outweigh their public duty to protect an innocent person from harm? This tension is at the heart of modern medical ethics. We see it in laws about mandatory reporting of infectious diseases or in debates about whether doctors should report patients who are medically unfit to drive. The question is, when is it right for a doctor to break a promise of silence? This dilemma, the conflict between private confidence and public good, was also a subject of intense debate in the medieval period, though it was framed in the language of souls and sins, not lawsuits and statutes. The bedrock of confidentiality in the medieval world was not the doctor's office, but the confessional. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, a hugely important gathering of church leaders, made annual confession to a priest a mandatory duty for all adult Christians. At the same time, it established the seal of the confessional as absolute and unbreakable. A priest could not reveal what he heard in confession for any reason, ever. The penalty for breaking the seal was excommunication. The soul's private relationship with God, mediated by the priest, was sacred and inviolable. But medieval physicians had their own, less absolute form of confidentiality inherited from the Hippocratic Oath. The oath states, "What I may see or hear in the course of the treatment, I will keep to myself, holding such things to be secret." The medieval doctors were expected to be discreet. A French surgeon from the early 14th century, Henri de Monville, wrote extensively about the practical art of being a doctor. He advised physicians to gain the patient's trust. He even suggested keeping some information from the patient's family to maintain a strong doctor-patient bond. A patient's secrets, whether about a shameful illness or a private habit, were to be guarded. Here is where the conflict arose. The church also instructed physicians to be guardians of the soul as well as the body. The same Fourth Lateran Council that cemented the seal of the confessional also decreed that physicians, when called to a patient's bedside, must first urge the patient to confess to a priest. The health of the soul took precedence over the health of the body. A doctor was a Christian first and a healer second. So, what happened when a patient told a doctor something that threatened the community? Imagine a merchant confessing to his physician that he has symptoms of leprosy. In the medieval world, leprosy was a terrifying disease, not just medically, but socially. Lepers were outcasts, forced to live in special colonies, and wear bells to warn people of their approach. A diagnosis of leprosy was a social death sentence. If the doctor keeps the merchant's secret, he honors his patient's trust. But he allows a contagious person to continue to interact with the public, potentially spreading the disease. He is failing in his duty to the community. Or consider the plague. A doctor examining a patient might recognize the first signs of the pestilence. If he keeps this confidential, he protects the patient and his family from immediate panic and ostracism. But he allows the disease to spread silently through a town, which could lead to thousands of deaths. The public peril is immense. Unlike a priest, a doctor was not bound by an unbreakable seal. He was part of a civic community and often employed by city authorities who were desperate to control the spread of disease. The medieval debate didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in medical texts and university lecture halls and in the daily practice of physicians. Thinkers like the Muslim physician and philosopher Avicenna, whose work was hugely influential in medieval Europe, wrote about the duties of the physician, which included advising public authorities on matters of health. There was a clear understanding that a doctor had a public role. The tension was between the personal, trust-based relationship with the patient inherited from Hippocrates and the public, community-based responsibility enforced by both civic and religious authorities. This is the very same tension that the California Supreme Court wrestled with in the Tarasoff case. They just used different words. The medieval doctor weighed his duty of discretion against the risk of plague. The modern therapist weighs confidentiality against the risk of violence. The core ethical question is identical. Where does the private duty end and the public peril begin? Number 8, changing the body is not the same as harming the soul. In 1966, a doctor named Harry Benjamin published a book called The Transsexual Phenomenon. It was the first major medical text to take a sympathetic and systematic look at people who felt a profound and persistent disconnect between their biological sex and their gender identity. Benjamin, who had fled Germany in the 1930s, had been treating transgender patients for decades. He argued that this was a medical condition and that the most effective treatment was not psychotherapy to change the mind, but hormones and surgery to change the body to align with the mind. He proposed a gatekeeping model where patients would have to undergo extensive psychological evaluation before being approved for medical transition. This work was groundbreaking, but also controversial. It placed doctors in the position of affirming a patient's internal sense of self by performing surgeries that were not for treating a physical disease in the traditional sense. These were not operations to remove a tumor or repair an injury. They were procedures to alter a physically healthy body to alleviate psychological distress and affirm an identity. This sparked a debate that has grown more intense over the years. What is the proper role of medicine? Is it to fix what is broken, or is it to help a person achieve well-being, even if that means fundamentally altering their body? And opponents argued that such procedures were unnatural, a form of mutilation. They questioned whether doctors should be performing irreversible surgeries on healthy organs. Proponents, on the other hand, argued from a position of patient autonomy and the relief of suffering. They pointed to the profound distress and dysphoria experienced by transgender individuals and the high rates of mental health issues when that distress is not addressed. Or they argued that medicine's role is to heal the whole person, not just the physical body. This debate forces us to ask deep questions about the relationship between the mind and the body, the definition of health and the limits of medical intervention. Is it the doctor's job to conform the body to the mind, or the mind to the body? This question about the legitimacy of altering the body for reasons other than life-threatening disease has a surprisingly long history. The medieval world had its own set of debates about the modification of the human form, framed through the lens of theology and natural law. The core idea they wrestled with was that the human body was a creation of God. It was made in God's image, and its form had a purpose. To alter it without a compelling reason was seen as an act of hubris, an attempt to correct or improve upon God's work. One of the most direct parallels can be found in medieval attitudes towards castration. The practice of creating eunuchs existed for various reasons, most famously for the choirs in some churches, particularly later in the papal choir. The pure, high-pitched voices of castrati were considered angelic. However, the practice was deeply controversial and the subject of theological condemnation. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas argued against it forcefully. Drawing on Aristotle and natural law, Aquinas believed that every part of the body had a natural purpose given to it by God. The purpose of the reproductive organs was procreation. To intentionally remove or destroy their function for another purpose, like preserving a singing voice, was a violation of this natural law. It was a form of mutilation that frustrated God's design. The argument was not just about procreation. It was about the integrity of the body as a whole. To remove a healthy part of the body was seen as a grave act. There were, of course, exceptions. Surgery was practiced in the medieval period, and amputation was a common procedure. A surgeon would amputate a gangrenous limb to save a person's life. This was considered morally permissible under the principle of totality. This principle states that a part of the body exists for the good of the whole body. Therefore, it is acceptable to sacrifice a part, the diseased limb, to save the whole the person's life. This is where the debate becomes interesting. A 14th century surgeon like Guy de Chauliac would have had no moral problem amputating a crushed leg after a battlefield injury. The reason was clear: to prevent death. But what about a procedure that was not life-saving? What about the early forms of plastic surgery? For example, there are records from the late medieval period of surgeons attempting to repair facial injuries, particularly noses lost in battle, or as a punishment. The famous Italian surgeon Gaspar Tagliacozzi, working a bit later in the 16th century but building on these medieval foundations, developed a technique to reconstruct a nose using a flap of skin from the patient's arm. Tagliacozzi faced moral criticism. His work was not saving a life, it was restoring appearance. His critics argued that he was meddling with God's punishment or interfering with the natural state of a person. He defended his work by arguing that he was restoring a person to their natural, God-given form. He wasn't creating something new, but repairing damage and allowing the person to participate fully in society without shame. He was, in a sense, arguing that his work improved the patient's well-being and restored the integrity of the person, not just the physical body. This is the same fault line as the modern debate. On one side, you have the argument from natural law and the integrity of the physical body. A doctor should only intervene to fix a physical pathology. This is the view of the medieval theologians condemning castration and the modern critics of gender-affirming surgery. They see the body as having a fixed natural purpose that should not be altered. On the other side, you have the argument for the good of the whole person. This is the view of Tagliacozzi, who saw that restoring a nose did more than just fix a face. It restored a person's dignity and ability to live in the world. It is also the view of modern doctors like Harry Benjamin, who argued that aligning the body with the mind alleviates profound suffering and allows the person to live a more whole and authentic life. The medieval debate was about God's design and natural law. Our debate is about identity, autonomy, and the definition of well-being. But we are still asking the same question: when is it right for a doctor to change a healthy body to heal a suffering mind? Number 7, knowing when someone is gone is not a new problem. On May 23, 1968, a committee at Harvard Medical School published a landmark report in the Journal of the American Medical Association. It was titled "A Definition of Irreversible Coma." The committee was formed to address a new and troubling problem created by medical technology. The development of mechanical ventilators and other life support systems meant that a person's heartbeat and breathing could be maintained long after their brain had ceased to function. These patients were in a state of permanent coma. They had no consciousness, no awareness, and no hope of recovery. Their bodies were being kept alive by machines. This created several ethical and practical problems. It placed a huge emotional and financial burden on families. It used scarce medical resources like ICU beds on patients with no chance of recovery. And it created a barrier to organ transplantation, which was a rapidly developing field. Vital organs could only be taken from a donor who is dead, but if death was defined as the stopping of the heart, then the organs would quickly become damaged and unusable. The Harvard Committee proposed a new definition of death. They argued that death should be defined not by the cessation of heartbeat or breathing, but by the irreversible loss of all brain function. They laid out a set of clear clinical criteria: unresponsiveness, no movement or breathing, no reflexes, and a flat electroencephalogram EEG. If these criteria were met, the patient could be declared legally dead and the ventilator could be turned off. This concept of brain death was revolutionary. It was quickly adopted into law and medical practice across the United States and around the world. But it was not without controversy. For some, it felt like a departure from a common sense understanding of life and death. How could someone be dead if their chest was still rising and falling and their body was still warm? It raised profound questions. What is the essential quality of a human person? Is it their consciousness, their ability to think and feel, or is it the biological functioning of their body as a whole? The debate over brain death forces us to confront the boundary between life and death, a boundary that technology had made blurry. We had to decide, as a society, what it means to be alive. This search for the precise moment of death, the point of no return, is not a modern invention. Medieval thinkers were also deeply preoccupied with defining death, not because of ventilators and organ transplants, but because of theology and a deep-seated fear of premature burial. For them, death was the separation of the soul from the body. This was a clear theological concept, but identifying the exact moment it happened was a practical and terrifying problem. The common understanding was that death occurred with the last breath. The connection between breath and life is ancient and intuitive. The words for spirit in many languages, including Latin spiritus, are linked to the word for breath. When the breath left the body, the soul was believed to depart with it. But experience showed that this wasn't always reliable. People were known to stop breathing for a time and then recover. There were many stories from the medieval period of people who were declared dead, prepared for burial, and then suddenly woke up, sometimes on their own funeral bier. This led to a culture of caution around the declaration of death. There was a customary waiting period, often several days, between apparent death and burial. The body would be watched over by family and friends during a wake. This was partly for religious reasons, for prayer and mourning, but it was also a practical measure to ensure the person was truly dead. People looked for signs of putrefaction, the one certain sign that the body's animating principle, the soul, was gone for good. Medical and philosophical texts of the period debated the signs of death. Thinkers who followed the Aristotelian tradition, which was dominant in medieval universities, located the seat of the soul not in the brain, but in the heart. For them, the heart was the central organ, the source of the body's heat and motion. As long as the heart was beating even faintly, the person was considered alive. The cessation of the heartbeat was a more definitive sign of death than the cessation of breath. This created a debate very similar to our own: is life located in the breath, the heartbeat, or something else? Consider the writings of the 13th century philosopher Albertus Magnus, the teacher of Thomas Aquinas. He wrote extensively on biology and medicine, drawing on Aristotle. He discussed the signs of life and death in detail. He argued that the principal spirit of the body resided in the heart. He described a hierarchy of bodily functions. A person could lose sensation and movement but still be alive as long as the heart, the root of life, continued to function. This is a medieval version of the distinction we make between higher brain function, consciousness, and brainstem function, autonomic processes. Albertus was grappling with the same problem as the Harvard Committee, how to distinguish between the loss of certain human capacities and the loss of life itself. The medieval concern was primarily spiritual. Declaring someone dead too early meant they might be buried without receiving the last rites, a sacrament considered essential for a good death and salvation. It also meant the terror of waking up in a coffin. The modern concern is primarily medical and ethical, how to use resources justly and facilitate organ donation. But the fundamental question is the same. The Harvard Committee looked for a flat EEG to know the brain was gone. The medieval family looked for the smell of decay to know the soul was gone. Both were searching for an undeniable sign that the essential human principle had departed from the body. Both were trying to draw a clear line in a reality that had become frighteningly ambiguous. Number 6, the right to say no, is a battle between two kinds of freedom. In 1990, a man named Donald Dax Cowart gave a powerful speech to a group of law students. He was a lawyer himself, but his story was not about a legal case. It was about his own life. In 1973, when he was 25 years old, Dax was in a horrific propane gas explosion. He was burned over 2/3 of his body. His father was killed. Dax was blinded, his hands were crippled, and he was in constant, unimaginable pain. He was taken to a hospital in Texas. From the very beginning, he wanted to die. He believed his life was over, and he did not want to endure the excruciating treatment, which involved being submerged daily in a tank of disinfectant to clean his wounds. He repeatedly and lucidly told his doctors and his mother that he wanted to refuse treatment and be allowed to die. "Please let me die," he begged them. But they refused. His doctors, committed to preserving life, and his mother, holding on to hope, overruled his wishes. He was subjected to years of agonizing procedures against his explicit will. He tried to take his own life in the hospital, but was stopped. Eventually, he recovered, went to law school, and became an advocate for patients' rights. Dax Cowart's story is one of the most powerful modern testaments to the principle of patient autonomy. He argues that every competent adult has the right to refuse medical treatment, even if that decision leads to their death. His case forces us to ask a difficult question: does a doctor's duty to heal and preserve life ever trump a patient's right to self-determination? The modern consensus in medical ethics is that it does not. The principle of informed consent, which includes the right of refusal, is paramount. A doctor can advise and persuade, but they cannot compel a competent patient to accept treatment. We believe that the right to control your own body is a fundamental human right. This modern emphasis on autonomy feels like a product of the Enlightenment, of thinkers who prized individual liberty and reason. But the philosophical roots of this debate are much deeper, tangled up in medieval discussions about free will. The concept of a person having the right to make their own choices, even bad ones, was a central element of medieval Christian theology. The entire moral framework of Christianity depended on it. Thinkers like St. Augustine in the 4th century and later Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century spent a great deal of time defending the concept of free will. For them, free will was what made humans human. It was a gift from God that allowed people to choose to love and follow God. Without free will, there could be no sin, but there could also be no virtue. A person who is forced to do good is not morally good. They are just an automaton. The ability to choose, to say yes or no to God's law, was essential for the soul's journey and salvation. Therefore, the freedom of the will was a sacred thing. This created a fascinating tension in the medieval medical world. On one hand, you had this profound theological respect for an individual's free choice. A person's soul was their own responsibility. On the other hand, the practice of medicine was deeply paternalistic. The doctor was the expert. And it was almost always he had studied the ancient authorities like Galen and Hippocrates. He understood the complex system of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile that were believed to govern health. The patient was largely seen as a passive recipient of the doctor's wisdom. The doctor's role was to diagnose the imbalance of humors and prescribe the cure, whether it was bloodletting, purging, or a change in diet. So what happened when a patient refused the doctor's advice? Imagine a 14th century patient with a fever diagnosed by a physician as having an excess of blood. The prescribed treatment is bloodletting, but the patient is afraid of the procedure and refuses. From a modern perspective, this is a clear case of patient autonomy. But the medieval doctor would have seen it differently. He would have seen the patient making a dangerously ignorant choice, not just for their body, but potentially for their soul. And sickness was often seen as having a spiritual component, a test, or a punishment from God. To refuse treatment could be seen as an act of despair or a lack of faith, a spiritual failing. The doctor was in a difficult position. He was a guardian of the body, but also a member of a community that believed the soul's health was paramount. He had a duty to preserve life, which was seen as a gift from God. Allowing a patient to die through what he saw as a foolish or stubborn refusal of care could be seen as a failure of that duty. The doctor, the patient's family, and the local priest might all pressure the patient to accept the treatment. They would be acting out of a genuine belief that they were saving the patient from his own poor judgment for the good of both his body and his soul. So we have two conflicting medieval principles. First, the theological principle of free will, which insists that a person's choices must be their own to have any moral worth. Second, the medical and social principle of paternalism, which insists that the expert knows best and has a duty to protect the patient from their own ignorance. This is the exact same conflict at play in Dax Coward's hospital room. The doctors, acting on their paternalistic duty to preserve life, overrode his wishes. Dax, on the other hand, was fighting for his right to exercise his own will, to be the author of his own life, even if that meant ending it. He was demanding a freedom that Augustine and Aquinas would have understood as essential to being human, even as the medical culture of their day would have struggled to grant it in a clinical setting. The modern victory of patient autonomy is, in a way, the resolution of a conflict that has been brewing for centuries. Number 5, the spark of life is an old question. In the summer of 1978, a baby named Louise Brown was born in Oldham, England. Her birth was a global media event. She was the world's first test tube baby, conceived through a new and radical procedure called in vitro fertilization, or IVF. Her mother, Leslie Brown, had blocked fallopian tubes and had been unable to conceive for 9 years. Two British scientists, Robert Edwards and Patrick Steptoe, had developed a technique to harvest an egg from Leslie's ovary, fertilize it with her husband John's sperm in a laboratory dish, and then implant the resulting embryo back into her uterus. The birth of Louise Brown was a medical miracle, offering hope to millions of infertile couples. But it also ignited a firestorm of ethical debate. For the first time, human conception was happening outside the human body in a glass dish. critics raised a host of concerns. They worried about the safety of the procedure for the children conceived. They were concerned about the creation and destruction of embryos. An IVF cycle often involves fertilizing multiple eggs and then choosing the most viable ones for implantation, with the spare embryos often being discarded or frozen. This led to a fundamental question. When does human life begin? What is the moral status of a collection of cells in a petri dish? Is it a human person with a right to life, or is it a potential person? Religious leaders, politicians, and the public at large were deeply divided. Some saw IVF as a beautiful application of science to overcome suffering. Others saw it as a dangerous step towards the commodification of human life, an unnatural interference in the sacred process of creation. They worried that we were playing God. This debate continues today surrounding issues like stem cell research, genetic screening of embryos, and surrogacy. All of these modern dilemmas hinge on that one core question: what is this thing we have created in the lab, and what are our moral obligations to it? The question of when a developing human life gains its moral status is not a product of IVF. It is a question that medieval scholastic philosophers debated with incredible intellectual rigor. They didn't have microscopes or petri dishes, but they had the writings of Aristotle and a deep theological need to understand the nature of the human person. Their debate was not about IVF, but about ensoulment. The question was, at what point in its development does the fetus receive a soul from God? The most influential ancient source on this topic was Aristotle. He was not a theologian, but a biologist and philosopher. Based on his observations of animal development, he proposed a theory of delayed ensoulment, or successive animation. He believed that the embryo first receives a vegetative soul, the kind of soul that plants have, which allows for growth and nutrition. Later, it receives a sensitive soul, the kind animals have, which allows for movement and sensation. Finally, at a later stage, it receives a rational soul, the unique attribute of a human being, which allows for reason and thought. Aristotle even suggested a timeline 40 days after conception for a male fetus and 90 days for a female. Medieval Christian thinkers had to grapple with Aristotle's hugely influential theory. Was he right? Did the soul arrive late in pregnancy, or was it present from the very beginning? This was not just an abstract philosophical game. It had profound implications for moral theology, particularly for the sin of abortion. If the rational soul was not present until later in pregnancy, then an early abortion, while still a sin, was not considered the sin of homicide. It was the destruction of a potential human life, but not an actual one. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century largely followed Aristotle's view. He argued that the physical matter of the fetus had to be sufficiently developed before it could receive the rational soul. The body had to be ready for the soul. He accepted the idea of successive souls, vegetative, then sensitive, then rational. For Aquinas, the destruction of an unformed fetus was a grave sin against nature, but it was not murder, because the being in question was not yet a rational human person. However, this was not the only view. Other theologians argued for immediate animation, the idea that the rational soul was infused by God at the moment of conception. They argued that from the very first moment, the embryo was a human being. The 13th century philosopher St. Albertus Magnus, Aquinas' teacher, leaned more towards this view, though the debate was complex. The lack of scientific knowledge about embryology meant that the entire debate was conducted on philosophical and theological grounds. They were trying to logically deduce the nature of a biological process they could not see. What is fascinating is how their abstract medieval debate maps directly onto our modern one. The arguments against discarding spare IVF embryos today are based on the principle of immediate animation, the belief that a fertilized egg is a human person with a right to life from the moment of conception. The arguments that support IVF and embryonic stem cell research often rely on a framework similar to delayed ensoulment. They make a distinction between a biological human organism and a human person with consciousness, rights, and interests. They argue that an early-stage embryo, a blastocyst of a few hundred cells, does not have the status of a fully developed person. When scientists in a modern fertility clinic look at an embryo under a microscope, they are looking at something medieval philosophers could only theorize about. Yet, the ethical questions they ask are the same. Is this a person? When did it become one? The medieval scholars use Aristotle and Scripture as their evidence. We use genetics and developmental biology. But the core of the dilemma, the moral status of the earliest stages of human life, has been with us for centuries. The debate that started in the lecture halls of 13th century Paris continues today in the laboratories and legislatures of the 21st century. Number 4, an illness of the mind is still an illness of the person. In 1972, a psychologist named David Rosenhan conducted a now famous experiment. He and 7 other sane volunteers, a group of students, a pediatrician, a psychiatrist, and a painter, got themselves admitted to 12 different psychiatric hospitals in the United States. Their method was simple. During the admission interview, they each complained of hearing a single, unclear voice that said empty, hollow, or thud. Apart from this one lie and faking their names and professions, they acted completely normally. They answered all other questions truthfully and behaved as they always did. Every single one of them was admitted. Most were diagnosed with schizophrenia. Once inside, they immediately stopped feigning any symptoms and behaved sanely. Their task was now to get out by convincing the staff they were healthy. It was not easy. The staff interpreted their normal behavior through the lens of their diagnosis. When one of the pseudopatients took notes, a nurse recorded in his chart that patient engages in writing behavior, seeing it as a symptom of his illness. The other real patients in the hospitals were often the only ones who recognized that the volunteers were sane. It took, on average, 19 days for them to be discharged. All but one were discharged with a diagnosis of schizophrenia in remission. Rosenhan's study, published in the journal Science under the title "On Being Sane in Insane Places," sent shockwaves through the psychiatric community. It raised serious questions about the reliability of psychiatric diagnosis. It suggested that once a person is labeled with a mental illness, that label sticks, coloring everything they do. The study fueled a growing debate about the nature of mental illness itself. Is it a real disease, like diabetes, with clear biological markers? Or is it, at least in some cases, a social construct, a label we apply to people whose behavior deviates from the norm? This debate continues today. We struggle with the stigma of mental illness, the overuse of medication, and the line between eccentricity and pathology. We are still asking what is mental illness and how should we treat the people who suffer from it. This struggle to understand and categorize afflictions of the mind is not new. So, the medieval period had its own complex and often contradictory views on mental illness. It is a common misconception that all mental disorders in the Middle Ages were seen as demonic possession. While that was certainly one explanation, it was far from the only one. Medieval medicine, based on the Greek system of the four humors, had a sophisticated naturalistic framework for understanding mental health. According to humoral theory, the body contained 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person had these humors in balance. Illness, both physical and mental, was caused by an imbalance, where melancholy or depression was thought to be caused by an excess of black bile, which was a cold, dry humor. This could lead to sadness, fear, and withdrawal. Mania, on the other hand, could be caused by an excess of yellow bile, which was hot and dry, leading to agitation and anger. And physicians who operated within this framework saw mental illness as a medical problem, not a spiritual one. Their treatments were aimed at rebalancing the humors. For melancholy, they might prescribe a diet of moist, warm foods, warm baths, music, and pleasant company. They understood that the mind and body were connected. The 11th century Persian physician Avicenna, whose Canon of Medicine was a standard medical text in European universities for centuries, wrote detailed descriptions of various mental conditions, including depression, mania, and psychosis. And he discussed their physical causes and proposed treatments that included both physical remedies and a form of early psychotherapy involving conversation and efforts to redirect the patient's thoughts. At the same time, a parallel supernatural explanation existed. Strange or violent behavior could be interpreted as a sign of demonic possession or divine punishment for sin. In these cases, the treatment was not a change of diet, but a spiritual intervention, prayer, pilgrimage, or, in extreme cases, exorcism. The community's response would be guided by a priest, not a physician. The challenge for medieval people was to distinguish between the two. When was a person's madness a medical issue, a case of bad humors, and when was it a spiritual crisis? This is not so different from the problem Rosenhan's experiment highlighted. The medieval physician had to decide if a patient's strange behavior was a symptom of an internal humoral imbalance or something else. The modern psychiatrist has to decide if a patient's report of hearing voices is a symptom of schizophrenia or a sign of some other distress. In both eras, the diagnosis depended heavily on interpretation. Consider the remarkable figure of Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, writer, composer, and mystic. She experienced powerful religious visions throughout her life, which she documented in her books. From a modern perspective, some might try to diagnose her with a neurological condition, like migraines. From a medieval perspective, her visions were seen as divine messages, but Hildegard was also a healer who wrote medical texts based on humoral theory. She understood the body in naturalistic terms. She wrote about melancholy and prescribed remedies like herbs and gemstones. She seemed to hold both the spiritual and the medical explanations in her mind at once. A person could be both a vessel for divine visions and suffer from a physical ailment. This dual approach reveals the complexity of the medieval understanding. They did not have one single theory of mental illness, they had several. The choice of explanation, medical or spiritual theory had profound consequences for the person suffering. A medical diagnosis led to care, however rudimentary. A spiritual diagnosis could lead to prayer and reverence, as with a saintly mystic, or to fear and ostracism, as with someone believed to be possessed. The debate was about the very nature of the affliction. Is this person sick, or are they sinful? Are they possessed, or are they out of balance? We are still asking a version of that question. Is this person's behavior a brain disease, a psychological reaction to trauma, or a deviation from social norms? The struggle to define and destigmatize mental suffering is a very old one. Number 3, trying to perfect nature has always been a dangerous idea. In 2018, a Chinese scientist named He Jiankui announced to the world that he had created the first genetically engineered babies. He had used a new and powerful gene editing tool called CRISPR to alter the DNA of 2 twin girls when they were single-cell embryos. The stated goal was to make them resistant to HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, by disabling a gene called CCR5. The announcement was met with widespread condemnation from the international scientific community. His work was seen as a shocking breach of ethics. The criticism was not just about the safety of the procedure, though that was a major concern. No one knew what the long-term health effects of this genetic change would be for the girls or for their future descendants, as the changes he made were heritable. The deeper issue was about the very idea of altering the human germline pry, the genetic blueprint that is passed down through generations. Jiankui had crossed the line. He hadn't used gene editing to treat a disease in an existing person. He had used it to create a new kind of person with a modified genome. This opened the door to a host of frightening possibilities. If we can make humans resistant to HIV, why not make them more intelligent, more athletic, or taller? Where do we draw the line between therapy and enhancement? The debate over designer babies is one of the most pressing ethical challenges of our time. It forces us to ask what it means to be human and whether we should be using our technological power to direct our own evolution. The central fear is one of hubris, the idea that in trying to perfect ourselves, we might lose something essential about our humanity. We are worried about playing God. This fear that in seeking to master and perfect the natural world, we might be committing a dangerous act of pride has deep roots in Western thought. A fascinating parallel can be found in the medieval world's complex and often fearful relationship with alchemy. It's a common caricature that alchemists were just greedy charlatans trying to turn lead into gold. While some were, alchemy at its highest level was much more than that. It was a serious philosophical and spiritual pursuit, a form of natural philosophy that sought to understand the fundamental principles of the cosmos. Alchemists believed that all matter was composed of a single primordial substance, the prima materia, which was then differentiated into the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. They believed that metals like lead and gold were not fixed and distinct substances, but different stages of development of the same underlying matter. Lead was seen as an immature, sick metal. Gold was the most mature, perfect, and healthy metal. The goal of alchemy, the great work, was to speed up this natural process of maturation, to heal the lead and bring it to its perfected state as gold. This was not just about getting rich. For many alchemists, particularly those working within a Christian framework, like the 13th century Franciscan friar Roger Bacon, this process was deeply symbolic. The purification of metals was a metaphor for the purification of the human soul. To perfect matter was to understand and participate in God's creative process. Bacon was a true scientist for his time, a proponent of experimental methods. He believed that alchemy was a legitimate science that could be used for great good to create better medicines and improve human life. But alchemy was always viewed with suspicion by the church and the wider society. It was often associated with magic, heresy, and fraud. The fear was that the alchemist was not just studying God's creation, but trying to usurp God's role as creator. By trying to transmute the elements, were they not claiming a power that belonged to God alone? The language used by critics of alchemy is strikingly similar to the language used by critics of genetic engineering. They warned of hubris, of pride, of meddling with things that humans were not meant to meddle with. The figure of Paracelsus, a Swiss physician and alchemist from the early 16th century, who stands at the cusp of the medieval and modern worlds, embodies this tension. He rejected the ancient humoral theory of medicine. He believed that illness was caused by specific external agents and could be treated with specific chemical remedies. He was a pioneer of pharmacology, but his work was deeply rooted in alchemical theory. He believed that the alchemist's job was to separate the pure medicinal essence of a substance from its impure poisonous part. This was a form of perfecting nature for human benefit. He famously wrote, "The dose makes the poison." Paracelsus was constantly in conflict with the authorities. He was seen as arrogant, a heretic, and a dangerous radical. He was trying to change the very foundations of medicine. His belief that he could improve upon nature, that he could create medicines more powerful than any simple herb, was seen as a profound challenge to the established order. The fear he inspired was the fear of the unknown, the fear of a power that seemed to tamper with the fundamental building blocks of life. The alchemist in his laboratory trying to purify and perfect base metals, and the modern geneticists in their lab trying to correct the human genome are engaged in surprisingly similar projects. Both believe they are using their knowledge of nature to improve the human condition. Both are accused of playing God. The medieval alchemist was seen as trying to tamper with the fixed hierarchical order of creation established by God. The modern geneticist is seen as trying to tamper with the evolutionary process. The core ethical question has survived the centuries: do we have the wisdom to control the powerful tools we create? And by trying to perfect human nature, what do we risk losing? Number 2, who pays for the sick, is a question of how we define a society. In 2017, a story circulated in the American news that captured the anxieties of many about their healthcare system. It was about a man who had a heart attack and was taken to the nearest hospital. The hospital was out of his insurance network. He received life-saving treatment, including a stent to open a blocked artery. He recovered, and then he got the bill over $100,000. His insurance company would only pay a fraction of it, leaving him with a debt that threatened to ruin him financially. His story was not unique. Millions of people in the United States face the choice between foregoing care and risking financial catastrophe. This situation fuels a fierce and ongoing political debate. Is healthcare a commodity, a service, to be bought and sold on the open market like a car or a television? Or is it a fundamental human right? Something that society must provide to all its citizens, regardless of their ability to pay? Those who see it as a commodity argue that a market-based system fosters innovation and efficiency. Those who see it as a right argue that it is immoral to let people suffer or die simply because they are poor. This debate shapes our politics, our elections, and our personal lives. It is a debate about the very nature of our social contract. What do we owe to one another? This question of whether a society has a collective responsibility to care for its sick was also a central issue in the medieval world. Their answer was not framed in the language of rights and markets, but in the language of faith and charity. The foundation of medieval healthcare for the poor was not a government program, but a religious duty. The model was the Christian concept of caritas, the selfless love for others that was seen as a reflection of God's love for humanity. One of the most visible expressions of this duty was the creation of hospitals. The medieval hospital was a very different institution from its modern counterpart. The word itself is related to hospitality. Places like the Hotel Dieu in Paris or St. Bartholomew's in London were not founded by corporations or governments, but by religious orders, bishops, or wealthy patrons. Their primary mission was not to provide advanced medical treatment, but to offer care and shelter to the needy in the name of God. They were hospices, orphanages, and old age homes all rolled into one. They took in the destitute, sick, the poor, the elderly, pilgrims, and those with no family to care for them. The care provided was often simple. The staff were usually monks or nuns, not trained physicians. They provided food, a clean bed, comfort, and most importantly, spiritual care. The goal was to heal the soul as much as the body. Attending chapel and receiving the sacraments were as much a part of the treatment as any herbal remedy. But the existence of these institutions, which spread across Europe, represents a powerful statement that the community through the church had a profound obligation to care for its most vulnerable members. This system was funded not by taxes or insurance premiums, but by charity. Wealthy nobles and merchants would donate land or money to a hospital as an act of piety. For them, this was a spiritual investment. They believed that such acts of charity would earn them grace and shorten their time in purgatory. The health of the poor was tied to the salvation of the rich. This created a system where care for the less fortunate was seen as a core function of the society, a moral obligation that bound everyone together. However, this system was not without its own set of problems and inequalities. It was not universal. The care you received depended heavily on where you lived and who you were. A person in a large city with a well-endowed hospital was much better off than someone in a rural village. And the system was based on the idea of the deserving poor. Hospitals could be selective about who they admitted, sometimes turning away those deemed morally unworthy. Furthermore, the wealthy did not use these charitable hospitals. They were treated in their homes by private physicians whom they paid directly. There was a clear two-tier system, one for the poor based on charity and one for the rich based on commerce. This medieval structure contains the seeds of our entire modern debate. The idea that society has a moral obligation to care for the sick, the core principle behind universal healthcare systems, is a secularized version of the religious duty of caritas that built the first hospitals. The medieval hospital, funded by the community for the good of the community, is the ancestor of the modern public hospital. At the same time, the practice of wealthy individuals paying for private physicians is the clear forerunner of our modern market-based healthcare systems. The medieval world had both models operating at once. They had a charitable system for the poor and a commercial system for the rich. Our modern debate is essentially about which of these two medieval models should be the basis for our entire society. Should we, like the founders of the Hotel Dieu, believe that caring for the sick is a collective moral duty, a form of social solidarity? Or should we follow the model of the wealthy medieval merchant and treat healthcare as a private service available to those who can afford to pay for it? The questions we ask about justice, fairness, and social responsibility in our healthcare debates were being answered in a very different language in the charitable foundations and private medical contracts of the Middle Ages. Number one, how to die is as important as how to live. In 1975, a 21-year-old woman named Karen Ann Quinlan collapsed after mixing alcohol and tranquilizers at a party. She stopped breathing for 2 periods of about 15 minutes, suffering severe and irreversible brain damage. She was rushed to a hospital in New Jersey and placed on a mechanical ventilator. She was left in what doctors called a persistent vegetative state. Her brainstem was still functioning, allowing for autonomic functions like breathing and heartbeat, but her cerebral cortex, the part of the brain responsible for thought and consciousness, was destroyed. She had no awareness and no hope of recovery. Her parents, Joseph and Julia Quinlan, after months of watching her lie unresponsive in an ICU bed, came to a painful decision. They were devout Catholics, and they believed that the ventilator was an extraordinary and artificial means of prolonging their daughter's biological life without offering any hope of restoring her as a person. They requested that the doctors turn off the ventilator and allow her to die naturally. The hospital refused, fearing a lawsuit. The Quinlans sued for the right to remove their daughter from life support. The case went to the New Jersey Supreme Court, which in 1976 issued a landmark ruling in their favor. The court affirmed a patient's right to privacy, which they argued was broad enough to include the right to decline medical treatment. Since Karen was incompetent to make this decision herself, the court ruled that her parents, as her guardians, could make it on her behalf based on what they believed she would have wanted. The ventilator was removed. In a surprising turn, Karen Ann Quinlan began to breathe on her own. She lived for 9 more years in a nursing home, never regaining consciousness before dying in 1985. The Quinlan case was a watershed moment in modern medical ethics. It established the right to die in American law and ethics. It led to the development of living wills and advance directives, legal documents that allow people to state their wishes about end-of-life care. The case forced a national conversation about the limits of medicine. When does treatment stop being about healing and start being a futile and burdensome prolongation of the dying process? When is it right to let go? The debate it started continues in discussions about palliative care, hospice, and physician-assisted dying. We are still struggling to define what constitutes a good death in an age of high-tech medicine. This search for a good death was also a central preoccupation of the late medieval period. They did not have ventilators, but they had their own set of anxieties about dying. For them, the quality of one's death was of supreme spiritual importance. The final moments of life were seen as the soul's last great battle against temptation. How you died could determine where you spent eternity. This led to the development of a popular genre of literature known as the ars moriendi, or the art of dying. These texts, which began to appear in the early 15th century and became hugely popular with the advent of the printing press, were essentially how-to manuals for dying well. They were written for a lay audience to prepare them for the final chapter of their lives. The ars moriendi texts describe the 5 temptations the dying person would face on their deathbed, brought by demons: a lack of faith, despair, impatience, spiritual pride, and avarice. For each temptation, a comforting angel would appear to offer a counter-argument, a remedy, to strengthen the dying person's soul. The core message of the ars moriendi was that a person should face death with conscious acceptance, repentance, and faith. The ideal death was a peaceful and prepared one, surrounded by family, having confessed one's sins and received the last rites. The ultimate goal was to find the right balance. The dying person had to avoid 2 opposing sins. One was despair, giving up hope in God's mercy and refusing to fight the spiritual battle. This would be like refusing a life-saving treatment for the soul. The other sin was an inappropriate attachment to earthly life, a refusal to accept God's will. This was a form of presumption, a desperate clinging to the physical world when it was time to let go. This medieval framework of avoiding the twin poles of despair and presumption maps directly onto the modern end-of-life debate that the Quinlan case brought to light. The doctors at Karen's hospital, in their insistence on keeping the ventilator running, could be seen as acting out of a modern version of the sin of presumption. They were clinging to the preservation of biological life at all costs, using every technological tool available, refusing to accept that the process of dying had begun. They were fighting against nature and, in the Quinlan's view, against dignity. The Quinlans, on the other hand, were trying to avoid the medieval sin of despair. They were not giving up on Karen. Their decision was not one of hopelessness, but of acceptance. They believed that continuing the aggressive treatment was futile and burdensome, and that the most loving thing to do was to entrust their daughter to God's care, to allow nature to take its course. They were seeking a peaceful and dignified end, the very goal of the ars moriendi. And at the center of it all is the principle we started with Thomas Aquinas' doctrine of double effect. The Quinlan's lawyers and the court that sided with them were making an argument that Aquinas would have recognized. They distinguished between ordinary and extraordinary means of preserving life. A ventilator for a patient with a recoverable illness is an ordinary means. But for someone in Karen's condition, it was an extraordinary means, one that imposed a great burden without a proportionate benefit. The act of removing the ventilator was not intended to cause her death the bad effect. It was intended to remove a burdensome and futile medical intervention, the good effect. Her subsequent death would be a foreseen but unintended consequence of the underlying brain injury. This is the logic of double effect applied to a 20th century dilemma. It is the same moral reasoning that allows a modern doctor to give a dying patient high doses of morphine to relieve pain, even if it might hasten death. The intention is to comfort, not to kill. The search for a good death, for a way to navigate the final moments of life with dignity and purpose, is a timeless human endeavor. The tools have changed, but the fundamental ethical questions remain exactly the same.